Welcome to Kendall and Cooper Talk Mysteries for our first episode of 2018. I'm Julie Cooper, a thriller writer and half of the duo bringing you this regular podcast series where we focus on mystery, suspense, and thriller fiction. We have a big name in mystery fiction joining us today, but first, thanks to my brother Chris Squires for our theme song, The Man in the Panama Hat. Wendy, I know you're chomping at the bit to introduce someone, but we'll keep our listeners in suspense for just a little longer.
All right, will do, Julie, because today we're talking about courage in writing. Great writing is truly inspirational, and our guest today truly writes inspirational books. I have no idea how she is able to continue to grow several series of very different and all exciting books that compel readers to wait breathlessly for the next one to read. I'm very excited that our guest today is J A Jance. Incredible author of mystery, J A Jance is the New York Times best-selling author of the J.P. Beaumont series, the Joanna Brady series, the Ali Reynolds series, and 5 interrelated thrillers about the Walker family, as well as a volume of poetry. Most recently, her thriller Clawback at Killer Nashville won Best Fiction Thriller, Reader's Choice Award for Best Thriller, Reader's Choice Best Book of the Year. Born in South Dakota and brought up in Bisbee, Arizona, J A Jance lives with her husband in Seattle, Washington, and Tucson, Arizona. I read on her website, www.jajance.com, that as a second grader in Mrs. Spangler's Greenway School class, Judith Jance was introduced to Frank Baum's Wizard of Oz series. She read the first and was hooked and knew from that moment on that she wanted to be a writer. I wonder if the Cowardly Lion's wish for courage, thinking he had none, was another seed that was planted. Maybe. Her writing beautifully describes characters as they summon and display courage in situations that demand it. Showing courage through writing requires understanding of human nature and the human psyche. Courage is a multifaceted quality and is demanded in different ways. For example, the courage to say no, courage in the face of death, courage in a tight spot that has terrible consequences, being able to move on and move forward. Stories of courage are important to tell, and mysteries are an especially wonderful fiction vehicle for showing characters' struggles. And to quote J A Jance, when you have an important story to tell, the words seem to come of their own accord. That's the end of her quote. And to that, what I say is that it's the hardest working, most skilled among us who are able to make it seem as if it all magically happens. I'm excited to welcome, with true admiration of her skill and talent, J A Jance.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here today.
And I'd like to welcome you as well, J A. And I have a few questions for you, so I'll get right to it. You've written a group of very successful series, and you show no signs of slowing down. My question fits under the refrain writers sometimes hear from agents and editors, the request to write something just like this, but different. So how does an established writer, a career novelist, keep coming up with a new story angle and not fall into the easy comfort of a series?
I have no idea.
I'm so relieved to hear that. But somehow you find a way.
According to physics, the bumblebee is incapable of flight, and yet it flies. And coming up with a new book each time and a different story each time is a lot like being a bumblebee, because right now, having finished the book, I'm at that stage where I'm feeling I shall never, like Agatha Christie always felt, I shall never write another book because I have quite forgotten how to do it. And yet I know that at some point the story will emerge, and it must emerge because the book has been sold, and if I don't write the book, then they're going to want their money back. And of course, I've already spent the money.
Oh, very good. Well, thank you. Thank you for that analogy.
But the truth is, I don't know how to do it. The last two Ali Reynolds books are books that were written entirely out of my comfort. I'm a liberal arts major, and I was dealing with artificial intelligence and bitcoins and things that I really had to learn about in order to write about them. So it was out of my comfort zone, but those books have been, the first one, Man Overboard, has been very well received, and the next one is due out this spring. But it was hard work because it was out of my comfort zone, and I think that's part of the secret of keeping the books fresh. It is going out of the comfort zone and writing something that you don't necessarily know everything about.
Good. That helps. That makes me feel a little bit better as a writer, too. Now, I've got a question that seems to stump a lot of writers. I realize this may be like asking a mother to name her favorite child, but who's your favorite protagonist of all your series, and why?
Well, Beaumont is my firstborn. In terms of my literary progeny. And so I have a very soft spot in my heart for him. He and I have been together as author and character since the middle of March of 1982. And that's a long time. And so he's a character that when it's time to write a book about him, I sort of take a couple of days, and then all of a sudden I'm in his book written in the first person, and within a few pages I'm inside his mindset, and I'm hearing what he thinks and his observations on the world, and it's sort of cantankerous
Mm-hmm.
Stuff that I know because I know him. So I would say Beau is my favorite. Joanna is a reflection of me and my life when I was in my late 20s and 30s. Ali Reynolds is a reflection of me in my 50s and 60s. And the Walker families grew out of the 5 years I spent as a teacher on an Indian reservation. So it's not a matter of one character being a favorite, I don't think. I think it's a matter of all of my characters being a reflection of a certain stage in my life.
Oh, that's fascinating, thinking about the passages that we all go through and having that reflected in your fiction. I'd never known that before, so thank you for sharing that. And I wanted to talk about Go ahead.
Yeah, in the Joanna Brady books, for instance, I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. My mother had a 7th grade education, and so I was sort of dismissive of my mother for a long time. And as soon as I had kids, my mother, who was 6, suddenly became a lot smarter.
Yeah.
But Joanna Brady's relationship with her mother at the beginning of the series in Desert Heat is very similar to where I was at that point in my life. So when I write the Joanna Brady books, when I'm writing Joanna's actions and thoughts and words, I'm sort of writing my point of view. And when I'm writing Joanna Brady's mother's point of view, I'm writing my mother's point of view. And I'm writing Jenny's point of view, which is Joanna's daughter. So that's my daughter's point of view. And writing those books is sort of like going through therapy.
I was just going to say, it sounds therapeutic, yes.
Because I end up seeing all three points of view and coming to a better understanding of them. The Joanna Brady is the product of a family where her father died when she was very young, and so in last parent standing situations, the parent who is dead gets a free get out of jail free card, and the parent who is left becomes the source of all evil. And so that was part of the dynamic of what was going on between Joanna and her mother Eleanor. As Joanna gradually matures, which can happen over the course of 17, 18 books, she finds out that, oh, wait a minute, my father wasn't perfect. He was actually having an affair. So maybe my mother isn't all evil either. And so she keeps hoping that at some point in her life, she and her mother will be able to have this sort of bonding mother-daughter experience. And then in Downfall, the most recent Joanna Brady book, Joanna's mother dies without that ever being resolved. And so now I have to see how Joanna is going to move on as the older generation, because now she is. With both of her parents gone, she's suddenly promoted to elder. And so those things happen in the background of the books. And I think that's part of what people love about my books, because I have enough words to use that they can learn the backgrounds of so many more characters. It's not just the front character, the good guy and the bad guy.
Right.
So
It
true.
makes it more of a tapestry.
Yes, and you've added a whole level of sort of psychological development, character development that I hadn't thought about before. So thank you for that. And I wanted to
You're
talk
welcome.
briefly about the importance of place in your work. And I'm the great-granddaughter of an Arizona territorial pioneer who also lived in Bisbee, Arizona a very long time ago. And someday I hope to write about her life there. But I think I'll need to go back again to really do the setting justice. Now, you've set mysteries in places such as urban Seattle, the reservation near Tucson, and the bucolic, quirky community of Sedona, Arizona, among others. What advice would you offer for writers who want to capture the essence of a place in their fiction, and especially writing about a locale that they're not familiar with?
Well, it can be a real trap. One of my favorite mystery writers was John D. MacDonald, who I loved reading about his Florida. It was astonishing to me that they put seashells down on their dirt roads. How can that be? How can there be that many seashells? Well, if you're from Arizona, it doesn't seem likely.
True,
But
true.
one of John D. MacDonald's mysteries was set in Phoenix, and he wrote it without going there. And so he had a character meet up with another character at the corner of First and Central. Well, there's a problem with that
Oh, yes.
because Central, those numbered streets never cross Central anywhere.
Correct.
The numbered streets are on the east side of Central, and the numbered avenues are on the west side of Central, and never the twain shall meet. And so that mistake in that book, I can't remember what book it was. I can't remember the title of it, but I remember that geographical error. And so I do my best to even when I'm writing about a place I don't know, I struggle with maps and try to make sure that I get the details as right as I'm able to do them. But for me, I wrote about Seattle when I was starting out because I was there. And Bo was a Seattle native. I had lived in Seattle for less than 6 months, so I had to learn a lot about Seattle in order to make the Seattle stuff correct. When I started writing the Joanna Brady books, it wasn't a big deal because I grew up in Bisbee, and I knew all those distances, and I knew what the desert smelled like after a rainstorm, and I knew where the storms came from, and so I was able to report on that stuff in the background while keeping my eye on what the characters were saying and doing in the foreground. So, but for me, writing a Joanna Brady book when I'm in Seattle, it's like going to Arizona for a while because my head goes there.
Right. Okay. Makes good sense. And I know at one point in your career you'd written true crime, and I so respect your sense of responsibility. You talked about writing true crime, and you said on your website, I'd had an emotional encounter with some of the still grieving family members of a series of murders in Arizona. Just meeting them once was enough to convince me that real murders affect real people. I stopped writing true crime on the spot. My question to you is, at what point does writing about violent crime, whether it's true crime or imagined crime that's based perhaps on real details, at what point does that cross the line?
In 1970, my first husband and I crossed paths with a serial killer. And he was a guy who killed people at 20 minutes after 2 on the 22nd day of the month. And half an hour after he forced a 28-year-old woman off the highway at gunpoint, shot her, raped her in front of her 2 children, and left her to die, he gave my husband a ride home to our house. We lived 30 miles from town, 2 miles off the highway, 7 miles to the nearest neighbor and or telephone. And he gave my husband a ride, not just to our turnoff, but all the way up the hill to our house. And on the way, he said, "Do you leave your wife out here by herself much?" And my husband said, "Well, she's got the dogs." Of course, when he said that, he had no idea he was talking to a serial killer. We figured that out later. When we went into town that evening, we were stopped at a roadblock and found out that there had been a homicide on the reservation. And my husband, a few miles later, said, "I wonder if that's the guy who gave me a ride home." And it turned out it was.
Oh.
The first book, we found out in the course of the investigation that he was a serial killer. They picked him up the 20th. I was on the hill by myself for probably 40 of the next 60 days because my husband worked construction during the summers.
Mm-hmm.
But I carried a loaded weapon. I was fully prepared to use it. I did fire it at a rapidly retreating rattlesnake and never hit him, but I figured if the killer showed up, he would present a larger target, and I was motivated. They picked him up on the 20th of July. He admitted to having been at our house on 3 separate occasions in the intervening 60 days. And we had been scheduled to be July 22nd. Okay, so what did I do with that? I put it away. I was raising kids. I was having working, and so I just sort of set it aside and didn't think about it. Then in the early 80s, I was here in Seattle, and we were supposed to do a talk about an event that changed our lives for our Dale Carnegie course. And I thought, whatever happened to me? And then I remembered May 22nd of 1970. And so I talked about that. And somebody said, somebody should write a book about that. Well, my first husband told me in 1968, there's only going to be one writer in our family, and I'm it. But I thought, I'm divorced now. What's to stop me from writing it? So I wrote a 1,200-page book called By Reason of Insanity, which was a thinly fictionalized version of that story. It was never published. The editors, I got an agent. She had me cut it in half, even at 600 pages. Nobody bought it. They said the stuff that was fiction was fine. The stuff that was real was unbelievable and would never happen. So my agent said, well, why don't you write something fiction? And I wrote the first Beaumont book. And then years passed. In 2001, the serial killer, by the way, shot people off moving vehicles. He shot a 16-year-old girl off a bicycle, a 40-something-year-old man off a bulldozer, and the 28-year-old woman who was driving her car. When I was doing an event in it's not Pace in Arizona. It's the other P word in Arizona.
Prescott?
Pine Top.
Oh, Pine Top, yes.
No, Pine Top. And there was a woman standing at the back of the room who didn't smile all through my talk, who didn't laugh, she just stood there with her arms crossed, listening to me. And when it was over, she waited until the very end of the signing. She came up to the table and she said, was your husband a witness in a series of homicides that took place in Tucson, Arizona in 1970? And I said, yes, he was. And she said, my father was the man on the bulldozer. With no further introduction, as though we had been having this conversation for 30 years. She said, my mother was pregnant with me when that happened. She would never talk to me about it. What can you tell me?
Oh, my.
And what I felt was this incredible gratitude that By Reason of Insanity was never published.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you for
I'm
sharing
sorry, that was a very long story.
That's all right, but thank you. I mean, that was very insightful. Well, I wanted to let you know I was go ahead.
The people whose lives are affected by real homicides never get over it. And I think telling a story like that for fun and profit is something that does cross the line. I have greatest respect for Anne Rule. I think what she did is she often allowed the families to have their say in a way that the justice system would not.
I'd agree with that. I'd agree with that. Well, I happened to be looking at your website and checked into your blog on December 22nd, 2017, and I just wanted to thank you for your very heartfelt entry for that date, talking about walking out of the fog and into the light using poetry. I've emailed it since to several friends going through hard times, and 2017, I think, was a difficult year for many, many of us in so many ways. But I didn't know until recently that you wrote poetry, which seems like an added gift to your readers. Any suggestions for promoting poetry as a means of healing a world that often looks and feels so broken?
Well, my book of poetry, I only have one book of poetry. Poetry was what I wrote during the years I was married to my first husband, when I wasn't supposed to be a writer, because he said there was only going to be one writer. He was allowed in a creative writing program at the University of Arizona that was closed to me. I tried to sign up, and the professor said, "You're a girl." And I said, "So?" He said, "Girls become teachers or nurses, boys become writers."
Oh, oh.
So I married a guy who was allowed in the class that was closed to me. Now, it is no accident that in the first Walker family book, Hour of the Hunter, the main character, Diane, was a teacher on an Indian reservation who always wanted to be a writer. Like me, she was married to a man who was allowed in the creative writing program that was closed to her. And the crazed killer in that book, my favorite bad guy in all my books, turns out to be a former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona.
That's karma.
But I was married. I was with him for 18 years. We were married for 13. We went together for 5 years prior to marriage. And so I wrote, but I wrote poetry under the dark of night when he was passed out cold in his recliner. We were out on the reservation, no telephone, no neighbors, and writers write. Because I wasn't supposed to be a writer, he never saw the poetry. I hid it away in the strong box every night after I finished writing. And then eventually I divorced him. I moved to Seattle from Phoenix because I was afraid I would take him back again, as I had so many times before. He had, in the previous 8 years, he had been hospitalized 9 times for chronic alcoholism.
Oh.
And I knew I was still susceptible to him, that if he asked me to take him back, I would. And so I did an adventure moving, loaded all of our worldly possessions into a U-Haul trailer, and my kids and I moved to Seattle, moved in with my sister in downtown Seattle in a condo. And a year and a half after I divorced him, he died of chronic alcoholism at age 42. Mm. You have to work really hard to die of booze at age 42. It usually takes several decades longer than that. I had lived through a particular kind of hell. And when it came time to get out all the documents that you need to do when somebody dies, the marriage certificates, divorce decree, I went looking through the strong box. And here was all this poetry that I had written starting in the 60s. And I thought I was being true to my art when I wrote it. But in actual fact, I was doing what writers do, using words to deal with the central issues of my life. So the title poem in the book, After the Fire, goes like this. I have touched the fire. It burned me, but I knew I lived. It seared me, but it made me whole. He called me. I went gladly, though I saw the rocks fell laughing through the singeing air. I have known the fire. I'll live with nothing rather than with less. The flame is out. There's nothing left but ash. And my whole writing career happened after the fire. After the fire, there was a lot of new growth. And you need the fire sometimes to burn that stuff out. And so that little book of poetry is, people write to me about it and tell me how somehow someone put that book in their hands when they were going through a particularly tough time. And those messages from people affected by the poetry who have found courage to live after their own fire, it really, those letters mean so much to me. I can't say how much.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Beautiful.
And beautiful. Yeah, I think of the symbolism of the phoenix rising from the ashes, and that's certainly what you did, with the major move and the writing career and all of that. So thank you for that. On a happier note, you've described writing as the best job in the world. And I'd have to agree with you on when I have good writing days, I would definitely say that. If you weren't
on bad
a mystery
days,
writer.
On bad writing days, it sucks.
True. This is true. It's pure hell. But if you weren't a mystery writer, what else would you be doing?
I can't imagine. I sold life insurance for 10 years, long enough to get a pension.
Ah, okay.
But selling life insurance was a means to an end. It was never what I wanted to do.
Sure.
It was a way to support my children. I can't imagine what I would do otherwise. I taught school. I didn't like being an English teacher. I liked being a librarian. I liked telling stories in classrooms. I told 26 stories a week in K through 6 classrooms for 5 years. I like that, but I can't imagine doing that for more than the 5 years I did it. So I guess I have a limited attention span.
But it sounds like all of those experiences built you into, what you are today and made those experiences relevant to your work as a mystery writer. So that's helpful to know.
Well, all in life, what I've come to understand is all steps are necessary. No steps may be skipped. And so, yes, being married to a man who died of booze, who gave me a sexually transmitted disease, all of those things, they were sort of bad things. But the good news is my second husband of more than 30 years said, well, I know I'm safe. You put up with so much from the first one. I'm not ever going to do anything that bad.
That makes him a prince, right?
Exactly. But it was all those things all of those things were part of what gave me my ability to see more than one point of view. For 18 years, I tried to figure out what made the guys in the bars so much more interesting to my first husband than I was. So I went to the bars with him, and I listened to all those guys. I tried to understand what made them tick. And it's that part of my education that I use when it's time to write a Beaumont book. Okay. So I needed to be in those bars to find out that stuff. And that's one thing more about After the Fire, the gift that book gave me. In 1985, I was invited to do a poetry reading of that book at a retreat for newly widowed people here in Washington State. And at that retreat, I met a man whose first wife, Lynn, died of breast cancer 2 years to the day after my first husband died of booze. They both died a few minutes before midnight on New Year's Eve. Bill and I met on the 21st of June. We got married on the 21st of December. And so that book of poetry was instrumental in this huge change in my life when I went from being a single mother with 2 little kids, living in downtown Seattle, to being a married mother with 5 kids and 6 grandkids, and now a great-grandchild. And so that book of poetry is truly a gift that keeps on giving.
Beautiful.
But how to promote it? I don't know how you promote it, except I talk about it at every book signing. I make sure that copies are available to be sold, and I think it's probably one of the best-selling books of poetry out there, because I've been selling it every year since 1982.
Wonderful. Wonderful. All right. Well, hopefully, maybe someday there'll be a second volume of poetry from you. And speaking of reading,
no,
go ahead.
It's hard to write poetry when you're happy.
I think that's true. Yes. I'd have to agree. Would you honor us, J.A., by reading from one of your mysteries for our listeners?
Let me think about that for just a second. I thought reading the poetry got me off the hook, but obviously that didn't work.
I don't know. What do you think, Wendy? We've been into some pretty heavy topics here.
Oh, we can definitely. Go ahead.
Just a second. I'm finding something. Hang on.
Good.
For 6 months, when I was trying to write the first Beaumont book, I didn't know it was a Beaumont book because I was writing it through the wrong point of view, and I couldn't get the book to work. Finally, it was spring break, and I sent my kids to Camp Orkila for spring break, and I sent myself to Portland to spend some time with a friend from my time in the life insurance business. So I got on the train down at the King Street station, and I thought, what would happen if I wrote this book through the detective's point of view? So I got on the train with a stack of blue line notebooks and a fistful of pens. And so as the train pulled out of the station, I started writing by hand. And this is what I wrote. She was probably a cute kid once, 4, maybe 5 years old. It was hard to tell that now. She was dead. The murder weapon was a pink holly hobby gown. What little was left of it was still twisted around her neck. It wasn't pretty, but murder never is. From the moment I wrote those words, I was inside Beau's head. I was walking the crime scene in his shoes. I was seeing what he saw, and it's been a very happy relationship.
That's spellbinding. I mean, just those few sentences, that's spellbinding. With J.A., go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I'm fine.
Oh, well, J.A., there was something that you said as you were talking very movingly about your book, By Reason of Insanity. And one of the things you said was that the true parts didn't sound believable to the agent or the publisher. That's something that I've often heard quoted, is that the difference between fiction and nonfiction is that fiction has to be believable. What is it that you do in your writing that makes your stories so very believable?
I don't know. I try to walk with my characters, and I try to see what's happening through their points of view, and I try to stay true to who they are. Um, I did a writers' conference once, and part of it, and part of the reason I don't do these anymore, is I was supposed to read portions of 25 manuscripts and then do 10 minutes in the barrel with the writers of these and
Oh,
talk to them. Yes, it was hell.
wow.
Yeah, sounds like it.
So, so this one guy wrote a genre jumping murder mystery because it was a time travel murder mystery. And, but he was walking around with a 3-inch thick file, a paper file, and I thought that was sort of odd. That if you could do time travel, you probably wouldn't need to carry the paper's work around with you. But the problem was all of the names of his characters had these really ethnic sounding names, but there was nothing in the characters' action that hinted toward their ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got to the point where we encountered female police officer number 1. And so I asked the guy in the interview, I said, well, how come female police officer doesn't have a name? Oh, he said, when I went through and did my search and replace, I must have missed that. And I said, you have to use words to paint a picture. You have to know everything about your character, whether or not it shows. You need to know, was he raised by a single parent? Was he Catholic, Protestant? Did he go to public school? You need to understand all of that so that when you write about your character, you'll know who you're talking about. So I poured out my heart to him, and I did my best to tell him what I thought was wrong. And he looked at me and he said, but is it publishable? No, it wasn't publishable.
Oh my.
But in this book, in the most recent Beaumont book, Proof of Life, he, as a retiree, is suddenly faced with taking in a rescued dog. And he's never had a dog because he was raised in an apartment over a bakery by a single mother in post-World War II Seattle. But I know that about him because I know his history. And you, as the writer, you are responsible for your character's history. All of it.
Yeah, that's really so inspiring. I mean, I'm just thinking about the passage that I wrote last night, and I'm just thinking, were you really thinking about what that character was doing? I'm going to go back and look at that. That's really inspiring. I can really see what you're saying. That they have to be so real to you, all of them.
Well, and sometimes I was writing Beaumont number 9, Payment in Kind, and I realized partway through the book that the person I thought was the killer didn't have what it took to be a killer, and I had to change my mind about who the killer was.
Wow.
And, as a writer, that's the hardest thing to change, your mind.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. In your Joanna Brady book, Downfall, I was particularly taken with the canine officers. It was about the time I read that book that I had the opportunity to go on a ride along with a local canine officer, and that taught me so much. How do you research your law enforcement characters, and what does it take to fill out that character on the page beyond their job description?
It's you have to think them into existence. It's nothing more or less than that. It's a thinking process. I can't explain it any better than that. I For my law enforcement background, I've watched a lot of forensic file kinds of stuff on TV.
Oh, you do.
I've made friends with police officers. One guy in Utah who works for the Attorney General there said that if his boss had a sense of humor, he would work for the shit squad because they do investigate special homicide. But he said his boss doesn't have a sense of humor.
In Random Acts that you wrote.
Okay, wait a minute.
I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
I just realized that there was something else that I needed to say in answer to your question.
Oh, good.
I come to writing police procedurals from the standpoint that the cops are people first and cops second. I'm always mindful that they're human beings before anything else, and I think that's part of what it takes to make them live on the page.
Nice, thank you. In your book, Random Acts, Joanna Brady and Ali Reynolds, they're characters in their own separate series, but they team up in a shared book and investigation. That's so fun for readers to get a surprise like that, and it's uncommon. In Fire and Ice, Beaumont and Brady share the investigation. And in Dance of the Bones, Brandon Walker and J.P. Beaumont join forces. And there's others like this. It's such a great idea. How fun is it for you to write different lead characters together? And also, what are the challenges for the characters to share a book?
Well, Random Acts and No Honor Among Thieves were two novellas, and they were actually, I think they actually made literary history, because those sets of characters belong to two separate publishers.
Oh, I didn't even realize that.
Allie Reynolds belongs to Simon & Schuster, and Joanna Brady belongs to HarperCollins. And I got them to agree to let me join those two characters in two separate novellas. And so it was sort of like Romeo and Juliet. But the thing about novellas is I took an important piece of Joanna Brady's life, the death of her mother and stepfather, and put it in a novella. And I don't think that was fair to my readers, because the people who don't read novellas were missing that very important piece of the story. And so I'm not sure I'll do it again, but I'm very proud of what I did with those two novellas. And it did bring me what I did that in each case at the suggestion of my editor, in order to bring readers who only read one thing or another. There are a lot of geographical readers in this world who will only read a book if it's set on Queen Anne Hill. And so it was a successful effort. The first time I did it was for a book called Partner in Crime. And my editor called me and said, you know, Judy, you have two separate sets of readers. You have Brady readers and the Beaumont readers. Is there any way you could get both sets of readers reading the same book? Could you write a book where Beaumont meets Brady? Well, my fans have been asking me that for a long time, and I kept saying, no, 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 couldn't happen, never happened. Well, then in the real Bisbee, Arizona, they built a new jail, and they built it with confiscated drug money, and they built it. They used the lowest possible bidder, and the low bidder actually hadn't ever built a jail before, so it didn't occur to him that maybe it was a bad idea to put drop ceilings in the cells. And so a couple of years after the new jail opened, one day, 4 inmates broke out of jail. They walked up the road a couple of miles, broke into the home of an elderly couple. They killed the man, tied up the woman, loaded the couple's worldly goods into their truck, and drove off in the couple's truck. 2 of them were captured the following day in New Mexico. The 3rd one was captured a year or so later in Florida. The 4th one was captured 3 years later in Tacoma, Washington. And suddenly, I could see that it was possible for investigations from Bisbee to Seattle to happen. So I had to overcome my personal objection to that story before I was able to write it, because I had to be able to believe it in order to write it. If I can't believe it, I can't write it, and my readers won't believe it either.
Very interesting. Well, you and Julie talked earlier a little bit about the importance of setting, and I really appreciate your world building that you create in your books with your settings. And it's, as you and Julie talked about, it's so important to the different stories. But in some writers' works, I can get impatient with the setting description when I feel like it's interrupting the flow of the story that I'm reading, or it's interrupting the action. How is it that you're skillfully painting that setting for the reader without it feeling like it's an intrusion?
Well, it's in the background. What the characters are doing in the foreground is where the story is. So the setting has to be there, but it has to be background. It can't be front and center.
So it sounds like that's something you're very conscious about as you're writing a scene.
I'm not sure I'm conscious of anything as I'm writing the scene. But I try. Years ago, my mother decided she wanted to learn how to make tortillas. So she had a Mexican woman come to our house, and she said, "Okay, you need some flour and you need some salt." And my mother said, "Well, how much flour?" And the lady said, "How many tortillas you want?" And I think it's sort of the same thing with this. It's not a matter of, it's sort of unconscious consciousness. It's not something I'm sure can be taught. It's part of the storyteller bone, and so I don't think I'm really conscious of keeping the setting in the background, but I know it's important to keep the setting in the background. And I'm not sure that's helpful.
That's very interesting, though. Wow. Well, let me hit you with another one that I've been struggling with. I have a writing mentor that gives me a lot of feedback, and something that's becoming ingrained in me now from all the feedback she's saying is she'll read something that I've written, and she'll say that she doesn't know what this character is feeling right now in the scene that I wrote. So I'm really getting ingrained how important the emotion is. And I think you talked about that a little bit also with Julie, the emotion that's how the reader's identifying with those characters. So I wanted to ask you kind of a twisted question about the emotion because it's been beaten into me. So here's my twisted question. For some of your lead characters, what do you find is their emotional Achilles heel? What's the emotion that's tripping them up?
I I don't know how to answer that question. I'm sorry. I When I'm writing a book, the if the story doesn't make me laugh aloud or shed a tear, or if at some point I don't have goosebumps on my leg, then I haven't done the story properly. But what emotion is tripping up my characters? I'm sorry, I can't figure out how to answer that question.
Because you're really living those emotions as you write them. It sounds like.
Yes,
Yes.
I am walking the story with my characters, and I think if you get inside the characters and walk with them, then you won't have to answer that question because you'll know it,
Yeah.
and so will your readers.
Nice. All right. I'm going to work harder on that. Your Walker family series beautifully weaves in legends and lore. And I'm probably going to mess up the pronunciation of this. I'm
To,
sorry. I don't know it.
to, to, Tahana Adam.
Thank you. From the Southwest, those people. Can you tell us a little bit about how you blend legends, fiction, and current day in your storytelling?
Hour of the Hunter was my first non-Beaumont book. It was my first non-first person narrative book. So Hour of the Hunter is told through 5 or 6 different points of view with this elastic time frame that goes back and forth, sort of like a rubber band, over 70 years. And so I spent 5 years as a K through 12 librarian on the reservation and told stories in classrooms each week. And many of the stories I told were the stories and legends of the Tohono O'odham people. When I set out to write the first Walker book, I loved those people. They loved me back. And I wanted to make the desert people come alive to someone from upstate New York who would never go to the reservation. And so I thought, well, what would happen if I put pieces of these stories, pieces of the legends into my story? And so that's where I started. I started with the Toy and Eagle Man story, and Toy hiding in a crack in a cave. And so as I was writing along, writing Hour of the Hunter was like French braiding a book, because I'd write part of the story through one person's point of view, and that would sort of stop. And so I'd pick up another thread and I'd tell. And if you read Hour of the Hunter, it's important to know that story is published exactly the way it was written. It wasn't outlined. It was just pick up one string of story, weave it over, pick up another strand, and weave it over. And I truly think that Hour of the Hunter is an amazing piece of fiction.
Beautiful. Well, I want to encourage our listeners again to check out your website. There's there's a delightful little link there to the Sugarloaf Cafe. And it's sort of a blog of meals that are found in fiction that your son has creatively made into wonderful real recipes that the readers can make. And I just think this is so much fun. And the recipes have been proven in your son, Tom Schilb, his last name, proven in his
Yes.
kitchen and rigorously taste tested by the whole family, as you say. So I'm just curious, as a cozy mystery writer myself, I just feel, could there be a cozy mystery at the Sugarloaf Cafe possibly in the future?
I don't think so, because Allie's parents sold it.
Oh.
And of course, the Sugarloaf Cafe is fiction. It doesn't exist in real life.
Yeah.
So people kept asking me about the sweet rolls, and finally Tom came up with a recipe. So the sweet roll recipe resulted out of requests from my fans because they wanted them. But food is an important part of my characters' lives, and so it's fun to have those recipes available.
Very nice. I was wondering, could you please tell us a little bit more about your most recent book, Proof of Life?
Proof of Life is Beaumont. He is sort of trying to figure out what he's going to do. He's retired. He's no longer the special homicide detective. The special homicide team has been disbanded, and so he's just sort of at loose ends and is trying to figure out what to do with the next chapter of his life. And he is sucked into a case because his long-term nemesis, Maxwell Cole, he and Max have been on the out since they were in college together. Maxwell Cole is murdered, and he leaves a message for somebody saying, if anything happens to me, please ask J.P. Beaumont to investigate it, because he'll get to the bottom of it. And there are people at Seattle PD who wouldn't. So he is sucked into the mystery at the request of the victim. So that's what that book is about.
I'm sucked into the mystery too right now, just from hearing that synopsis.
A great premise, yeah. Truly. Well, I'm going to launch into my segment for our episode, and I'm calling it Page Fright and the First Essential. Wendy started the episode off by talking a little bit about courage, and I wanted to continue in that vein. Courage is what Catherine Ann Porter called the first essential for all writers. I recently finished reading an article about writers who'd gotten multiple rejections, not just one or two, but dozens over a period of years, with some rejections even numbering into the hundreds, for books which went on to be published and became bestsellers or won major awards, including the Anthony, the Booker Prize, a National Book Award, or even a Pulitzer. In spite of many obstacles, these writers persevered and were all better for it. Writing is a scary process for many of us and brings anxiety, but a normal fear of writing can be conquered. So I asked myself, why are we so afraid of this endeavor? Well, there's a list taken from a helpful book on the subject by Ralph Keyes called The Courage to Write. There's fear of self-revelation, there's the fear of being criticized, and the fear of self-discovery. He goes on to say that Anxiety is a normal, manageable, and even useful part of the writing process. And I think that's easy for you to say when you're not sitting there staring at a blank screen. E.B. White once famously said, "I admire anyone who has the guts to write anything at all." And Ta-Nehisi Coates, author of the amazing book Between the World and Me, which looks at race in America, said, "I strongly believe that writing is an act of courage. It's almost an act of physical courage." And he suggests that the way out of fear goes like this. It's not really that mystical. It's like repeated practice over and over, and you suddenly become something you had no idea you could be. I especially related to writer Cynthia Ozick when she admitted, "I have to talk myself into bravery with every sentence, sometimes every syllable." So with the start of the new year, here's to putting yourself out there or trying something new, whatever your creative endeavor might be.
Very nice. Thanks, Julie. Today I wanted to talk about secondary and walk-on characters. And my topic, it was inspired by something that our guest J A Jance has said about fictional characters. And she also talked about it a little bit with us today. Quote, "Just because I'm not paying attention to them doesn't mean they're not going on with their lives." That's referring to the fictional characters. I've learned that characters have to feel tangible to their authors in order to be successful. The movie The Man Who Invented Christmas, about Charles Dickens writing A Christmas Carol, very creatively shows something of this. Yes, secondary and walk-on characters are in scenes for a conscious purpose that the author has for the story. They act for or against the protagonist, and they help move the story. My writing mentor has a great example. If you've seen the movie The Proposal, starring Sandra Bullock, there's a barista at the very beginning of the movie. That barista is there to quickly reveal some specific characteristics about Ryan Reynolds' character. When Ryan Reynolds leaves the shop, we never see that barista again, but subconsciously I know that that barista is continuing with her workday and with the life that she has. How can these characters, like the barista, fulfill their purpose if they're not fully dimensional beings? How can they aid a protagonist if there isn't a feeling that they've lived their own experiences? How can they be a contrast or a contribution if they don't have their own background? Some secondary characters have made such strong impressions they return in sequels, or they may have a spin-off story of their own. True in novels as in life, we're each the lead character in our own life story, and we're the secondary or walk-on to other people's stories. Have the courage to be kind to each other and strive to leave a positive effect in your scenes. That's my thought for the day. And I'm going to go ahead and give my recommendation for a mystery book. For today's book recommendation, in addition, of course, to my fandom for our guest books, J A Jance's books, today I'm also recommending the Ray Courage Mystery Series by Scott Mackey. Now, unlike the J.P. Beaumont and some of the other characters, this protagonist is an amateur, a novice private investigator. In the prequel novella titled Courage Begins, characters Garrett and Tiffany Bate, they had it all: youth, money, and a perfect marriage, until Tiffany is killed in a suspicious accident. Neither the police nor the insurance investigators can prove she was murdered, and the case turns cold. 2 years later, the insurance company asks an intern. This intern is former college professor turned private eye at 52 years old, Ray Courage, to reopen the investigation. Now, there's another kind of courage. Who starts a PI career at age 52? The reader learns about becoming a fictional PI along with the character in this first novella. Ray uncovers little new evidence to support suspicions that Garrett killed his wife for the insurance money. Garrett has the perfect alibi, hundreds of witnesses that place him more than 2 hours from the scene of Tiffany's death. Ray knows he's missing something, but what? As his search for the truth unfolds, Ray's life is put in jeopardy, and he realizes that his adversary is someone who will kill before he'll be caught. What's fun is that these private eye stories also have ingredients of traditional mystery, locked room type puzzle style. In this prequel to Courage Matters, Ray Courage begins his private investigation career with skills and a sense of humor and courage. The author, Scott Mackey, lives in Northern California where he writes both fiction and nonfiction. He launched the Ray Courage mystery series in 2014 with the release of Courage Matters, and followed with Courage Begins, and then Courage Resurrected. And the fourth Ray Courage mystery is entitled Courage Stolen. The fifth and the last in the series so far is Courage Lost. The Ray Courage books are written as standalone mysteries, and you can read them in any order. All right, now I'm wondering what our guest would like to recommend.
Well, I enjoy the Ann B. Ross's Miss Julia books. And I'm just started off reading one, and it's what I'm going to do on our trip as we drive to Arizona. I'll be reading that book in the background.
Very nice.
I'll have to check that one out. I'm not familiar with that one. Great. Well, my recommendation this time, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No, I'm sorry.
My recommendation actually is not a book, but it's a new television series, one I have not seen yet, called The Alienist, from the Anthony Award-winning best-selling suspense novel by Caleb Carr. He was interviewed recently, and this is what he said in his press release. After 20 years of tough struggles and countless failed attempts, Paramount Television, Anonymous Content, and TNT joined forces to bring The Alienist to life. He went on to say the team adapted The Alienist for live action in a way that both preserves the intellectual and historical integrity of the tale while adding a gripping cinematic dimension. So, what's this all about? In 1896 New York, Police Commissioner Teddy Roosevelt calls upon a criminal psychologist, Dr. Laszlo Kreutzler, who is known as an alienist for studying criminal outliers who commit multiple murders, and also crime reporter illustrator John Moore. He wants them to conduct a secret investigation into the gruesome murders of child prostitutes. Joining them is a headstrong young secretary at police headquarters, Sarah Howard, who aims to be the city's first female detective. Underlying this series is the birth of criminal profiling, the field of psychology, and the very early days of forensics. The series of 8 episodes, coming soon, stars Luke Evans, Dakota Fanning, and Daniel Bruhl, and will premiere on January 22nd at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on TNT. I'm really looking forward to watching and hope they do justice to this wonderful book. Caleb Carr signed on as a consulting producer along with screenwriter Eric Roth and the legendary writer John Sayles. So I'm saying and hoping that the odds are good that this will be a compelling series. Stay tuned. Well, that's a wrap-up for this episode, our first in 2018, and our special thanks to J A Jance for joining us on the first of many author interviews. We're really looking forward to many more best-selling books from you. And I'll be thinking of you on my next trip back to the old Pueblo and onward to Bisbee, Arizona. You just never know when a visit to a new place or an old one can spark inspiration. And sometimes you have to be in the right place for those characters to begin to speak. Listeners have asked us what's ahead for Kendall and Cooper this year. Heading into winter and on into spring, we'll be bringing you historical mystery writers, emerging writers of noir fiction, thriller writers, a middle grade mystery writer, and some diverse voices which need more attention from readers. Keep reading and keep writing.